If you are a deep thinker, you have probably spent time after social situations feeling a kind of exhaustion that does not make logical sense. You were not doing physical labor. The conversation was fine, maybe even enjoyable. Nobody was difficult. Nothing went wrong. And yet you arrive home feeling like you ran a marathon in your own head, needing hours of silence just to feel like yourself again. Most people chalk this up to introversion. And while introversion is part of the picture, it is not the complete explanation. Because the exhaustion deep thinkers feel after social situations is not just about being around people. It is about what their brain does automatically in the presence of people. A process that runs whether they want it to or not, consuming cognitive resources at a rate that most people never experience and therefore never think to account for. By the end of this video you will understand exactly what that process is, why deep thinkers cannot simply turn it off, and, most importantly, why certain social situations leave you far more depleted than others even when they appear equally demanding on the surface. But first, there is one specific type of social interaction that drains deep thinkers more than any other. More than large crowds, more than difficult people, more than long events. It is something far more ordinary than any of those things. And when I name it later in this video, you will immediately know exactly what I mean because you have felt it dozens of times without ever having a precise explanation for why it hit so hard. First, let us understand what is actually happening inside a deep thinker's mind during a social interaction. Because it is considerably more complex than most people realize. When the average person has a conversation, they are processing one primary layer of information, the content of what is being said and their response to it. That is the conscious, verbal layer of the exchange. Most people operate almost entirely on this layer. They hear what you say, they form a response, they deliver it. The process is relatively linear and relatively efficient. Deep thinkers are simultaneously processing several additional layers that most people never access. They are tracking the emotional subtext beneath the words, what the person seems to actually mean versus what they are literally saying. They are monitoring the relational dynamic, how the power in the conversation is distributed, whether it is shifting, what the other person's behavior reveals about their internal state. They are cross-referencing what is being said against everything they already know about the person, looking for consistency or inconsistency. And they are doing all of this while also managing their own participation in the conversation, choosing words, timing responses, navigating the social expectations of the interaction. Here is the strange part. None of this feels like effort while it is happening. It feels like just being present, just paying attention, just having a normal conversation. The processing is so automatic, so deeply embedded in how deep thinkers engage with the world, that it does not register as work. But it is work. Significant, sustained cognitive work. And the exhaustion you feel afterward is not a personality quirk. It is the entirely predictable result of running a complex multi-layered processing system for an extended period with no pause button. Which raises the question, if the processing is automatic, can it be managed? And why do some situations trigger it far more intensely than others? Not all social situations drain deep thinkers equally. And the difference has almost nothing to do with the size of the gathering, the length of the interaction, or even how much you like the people involved. It comes down to one specific variable, how much cognitive uncertainty the interaction contains. Cognitive uncertainty in a social context means any situation where the signals you are receiving do not clearly add up, where what someone is saying and how they are behaving do not quite align, where the emotional atmosphere of the room is slightly off but nobody is acknowledging it, where you cannot tell if someone is genuinely fine or performing fine, where the conversation has an undercurrent that everyone seems to be carefully navigating around without naming. These situations are not necessarily dramatic. They do not require conflict or obvious tension. They can look completely normal from the outside. But for a deep thinker whose brain is automatically scanning for meaning beneath the surface, an interaction full of unresolved signals is like trying to solve a puzzle that keeps changing its own pieces. The processing never reaches a satisfying conclusion. The system keeps running because the data keeps arriving without resolution. And that sustained, unresolved processing is where the deepest exhaustion lives. Has this ever happened to you? You leave a social situation that seemed perfectly pleasant, and yet something about it sits with you for hours afterward. You keep replaying specific moments, wondering what someone meant by a particular comment, trying to determine whether a certain dynamic was real or imagined. The interaction is over, but your brain has not filed it away yet because it found something that did not resolve, and it is still working on it long after you got home. That is not overthinking. That is your cognitive system doing exactly what it was built to do, searching for complete understanding in an interaction that did not fully provide it. And this leads to the specific type of social interaction that drains deep thinkers most. The one I mentioned at the beginning. It is not parties. It is not difficult conversations. It is not even conflict. It is surface-level interaction with people you know well enough to sense depth beneath, but not well enough to access it. Strangers are actually manageable. You do not have enough context to detect incongruence, so the processing stays relatively light. Close friends are manageable too. The relationship is established, the signals are familiar, the uncertainty is low. But the middle layer, acquaintances, colleagues, people you see regularly but never deeply, sits in a cognitive no man's land. You have just enough information about them to notice when something seems off, but not nearly enough context to understand what that something is. So the processing runs at full intensity and reaches no conclusion. Most people completely miss this distinction when they try to explain why certain social situations exhaust them more than others. They focus on quantity of interaction rather than quality of cognitive load. They think the solution is fewer people or shorter events. But a deep thinker can leave a 2-hour dinner with close friends feeling relatively restored and leave a 30-minute work function feeling completely hollowed out. The number of people was not the variable. The unresolved cognitive uncertainty was. And if you relate to that experience, what comes next explains something even more important: why this exhaustion accumulates across days and weeks in a way that a single night of rest rarely fully resolves. Remember the specific type of interaction I named at the beginning, the one that drains deep thinkers more than any other? Surface-level interaction with people you know just enough to sense something beneath but not enough to access it. Here is why that particular dynamic accumulates in a way that goes beyond ordinary tiredness. Every unresolved interaction leaves a small open file in a deep thinker's mind. Not a dramatic one. Not something that feels urgent or distressing. Just a quietly active background process. A thread of unfinished cognitive business that the brain keeps returning to in idle moments, searching for the resolution it never found during the actual interaction. One open file is barely noticeable. 3 or 4 starts to create a low-level mental hum. After a full week of social interactions that each left something unresolved, the accumulated weight of all those open files is what produces the specific exhaustion that sleep does not seem to fully fix. This is why deep thinkers often describe feeling tired in a way that is different from physical fatigue. Physical fatigue responds to rest. This kind of exhaustion responds to resolution, to finally understanding something that was unclear, to having a conversation that actually went somewhere real, to spending time in an environment where the signals match the surface and the processing can finally stop running at full capacity. Here is the strange part that most deep thinkers never fully connect. The environments and interactions that restore them are not simply quiet ones. They are honest ones. A loud, chaotic gathering with people who are completely genuine is far less draining than a quiet, polite dinner full of carefully managed impressions. The noise is irrelevant. The cognitive load of decoding inauthenticity is what costs the energy. And this reframes the entire question of how deep thinkers should manage their social lives. The standard advice, limit social exposure, schedule recovery time, protect your energy, is not wrong. But it is incomplete, because it treats all social interaction as equally draining and prescribes quantity reduction as the primary solution. What actually makes the difference is not how much social interaction you have. It is how much cognitive uncertainty that interaction contains. Now here is the part that changes how you move through the world practically. You cannot always control who you spend time with or what social situations you find yourself in, but you can change what you do with the unresolved material those situations leave behind. Because the open files do not have to stay open indefinitely. The most effective thing a deep thinker can do after a cognitively demanding social interaction is not to distract from it or push it down. It is to briefly and deliberately process it, not obsessively, not anxiously, but with the specific intention of reaching a conclusion and closing the file. Sometimes that conclusion is simply, I notice something unclear there and I may never fully understand it, and that is acceptable. That single act of conscious closure does what hours of unconscious rumination cannot. It tells the processing system that the file has been reviewed and does not require further background attention. This sounds deceptively simple, but for a mind that defaults to leaving things open until they are fully resolved, the deliberate choice to close something at good enough rather than complete is a genuine skill. One that takes practice. One that runs against the deep thinker's natural instinct toward thoroughness and total understanding. But it is the skill that makes the difference between a social life that consistently depletes you and one that occasionally challenges you without hollowing you out entirely. You were not built wrong for finding this exhausting. You were built for depth in a world that mostly operates on the surface. That mismatch has a real cost, but it also has a real solution, and it starts with understanding precisely what your mind is doing, rather than simply feeling the weight of it without knowing why.